In today's video I'll be painting the GSA side of Operation Sandtrap, the latest starter set for Infinity, close to how they look on the box art, but only in 2.5 hours per model. Corvus Belli is not sponsoring the video, but they were kind enough to send me a copy to paint. It took some time to arrive, but it's finally here, so I decided to paint the Japanese side of the box first. To be honest, I really like the color scheme of Pan-Oceania, but the GSA models are simply too cool to resist. I love ninjas and samurai in general, and these guys are ninjas and samurai in space. I think I can just rest my case with that and there is no more explanation needed. If you are familiar with Infinity models, then you probably know that most of them are super high quality metal minis, and this is exactly what we get here as well. The models are crisp, they are easy to assemble, and they have great designs that look fantastic when painted. They look so good in fact that I decided that this time I'm not going to use contrast paints. I usually paint these starter sets with contrast because I know that many of you guys are more comfortable with them. But then I am usually not 100% happy with how they turn out. Don't get me wrong, I'm still going to basically speed paint them. I will spend as much time on the 7 models as I would usually spend on a single character model. But I will use regular paint, only brush, no airbrushing today, and I will try to squeeze as much quality out of the time I spend on them as possible. And if on top of the video you want to have all of the steps in a written form as well, so you can follow along, you can download the 60-page PDF from my Patreon. But don't worry, I will break what I'm doing down into easy to follow steps in the video as well, so you guys can make some super cool looking Space Samurai of your own. And with that, let's get some paint on these models. I started from a simple black primer, no fancy colored undercoats today, mostly because it wouldn't really benefit us with this color scheme. And there are two main colors that we need to get right, the red and white armor in garments, so let's base coat those first before anything else. I use Mephiston Red for this. It's one of the best red paints you can find, it covers well and the color is nice and vibrant, which is exactly what we need here. I selected the panels I needed to paint by looking at the art in the booklet that came with the box. You don't need to follow it exactly, I haven't either, but it's a nice guide to have so you don't have to figure out what should be red and what should be white. I covered the whole surface with multiple layers until I got full coverage everywhere. Next, I decided to block in all the white elements as well. This is a matter of preference though, you can start highlighting the red immediately before going for the white, but I wanted to see the two main culprits on the model before I started the highlights. I did this with Basalt Grey from AK Interactive, but the brand is not important here. You could do this with Mechanica Standard Grey from Citadel as well if that's what you have. As long as you go with a relatively dark grey, you should be good. If you are a returning viewer, you're probably not surprised that I'm using grey colors to start the white, and if you're a new viewer, just bear with me, it will look white in the end, I promise. And by the way, if you are one of those regular viewers and you are not subscribed, now is a good opportunity to hit that subscribe button. You are watching my stuff anyway and it really helps the channel out. Going back to the painting, I once again used multiple consecutive layers to achieve complete coverage, meaning that I couldn't see the black primer peeking through the layers anymore. Alright, we have the two most important colors blocked in on the models. Now we don't have to think about what goes where, we just have to highlight everything we have just painted. The problem is that red and white are two of the most difficult colors to work with, so we are facing a bit of a challenge, but where there is a will, there is a way. I started by highlighting the red, and since my first color was Mephiston Red, I decided to follow through with its usual highlight colors from Citadel. Evil Sun Scarlet is another great red color, and I used this to cover quite a bit of the original Mephiston Red. I made sure to highlight all the edges of the armor and the raised bits of the red garments. I used quite thick highlights here so that later I could fit some thinner ones inside them. These models are quite small and consequently the panels we are painting here are tiny as well, but wherever there was a little more space I also created some bigger highlights. And where I could I also added some scratches either coming in from the edges or around the bigger highlight spots I painted on the panels. Our next color will be Wild Rider Red. With this I did essentially the same, but I tried to make the highlights a little bit smaller and thinner inside the previous one, but without completely obscuring it. The idea is that we will have a progression of brighter and brighter colors creating a transition, and if we paint over the entire previous layer that won't happen, so let's try to avoid that. I actually switched to a smaller brush for this, but I later regretted that and switched back to the bigger one. For tiny highlights you don't really need a small brush, just a very sharp tip. I keep falling into this trap and the result is always the same. I struggle with the paint consistency because the paint is drying too fast in the tiny bristles. So don't make the same mistakes as me, a normal size brush, let's say a size 1, but with a sharp tip will serve you better. With this done, I couldn't really go any brighter with reds without turning the highlights into pinks, so I made a sidestep and switched to Fire Dragon Bright, a light orange color. I usually prefer highlighting my reds with orange since it produces a nice vibrant result, but we need to be careful not to overpower the reds with the oranges and turn the whole armor orange instead of red. I was more selective with this one. I didn't paint all the edges, I was mostly focusing on the ones that would be facing the light. I still added small highlights inside the previous one and some very thin scratches where I could. Despite our best efforts with all these highlights, it's likely that our red armor turned either a little too faded or maybe too orange. Both of those issues can be fixed by a thin glaze of red ink or contrast paint. I used bar red contrast for this, but you could also use a simple red ink, or if you don't have any inks or contrast, you can thin down the original Mephiston red as well. I watered it down considerably and glazed it into the midtones and shadows, which is a fancy way to say that I started dragging it from around where we did the Evils and Scarlet and finished my brush strokes in the pure Mephiston red. But I was careful not to paint this over the orange highlights. After this step the red should pop way more, but we can improve the contrast a little more. I took one of my favorite paints for shadows, Dark Sea Blue, and thinned it down a lot, to something like 80% water and 20% paint. If you don't have this one, you could use some staggered on scale green from Citadel as well, or any dark blue-green color that you have. I glazed it into the deepest shadows, and I also dropped it into some of the recesses to help with separating the various elements and creating more definition on the figures. At this stage it's likely that you smudge some of the things that are inside and around the red bit, so now that the messy parts are done we can use some black paint to fix that. This way we can see what we have done so far. This part might look scary since you are painting inside the red you have already highlighted, but just take your time, brace your arm and wrist and carefully use the tip of the brush to block in everything without touching the red. There, that looks much better. Now that we can see what is what, we can finish with the last highlight on the red. This might seem like an excessive amount of highlights for a single color and we will use less for the secondary colors, but red is one of the main colors in the scheme, so it's worth spending the extra time on it. I selected Pastel Peach for the final highlight, which might look like a weird choice, but it's essentially an orange with quite a bit of white in it, so it's perfect for small, high contrast highlights. I use this very sparingly, mostly just marking some of the most visible edges and corners where they would be facing the light. Really don't go overboard with this because it might completely overpower the red quickly, but just a couple of edges and corners will add a lot of definition and crispness to the models. And with that we finished one of the most difficult parts of the paint job. Now we can tackle the white and after that it will be easy peasy. More or less. I started painting the white bits with reddish grey, but once again you can substitute this with whatever you have available. For example, if you have Citadel paints and you want to end up with a very similar end result, you could use Stormvermin Fur. But as long as you use any slightly brighter grey than the base color you should be fine, but the tone of your armor might end up slightly different. I covered most of the surface with this except a small section on every panel where I wanted the shadows to be, but even in the shadow sections I still edge highlighted everything. Most of the time I left these shadows at the bottom of the panel where it was the farthest from the light. And I made the transition a little scratchy to make it easier to smooth it out later. The next color I used was medium grey, and you could use something like Hawthorne Grey from Citadel to replace this. This is quite a bit brighter than the previous one and a very different colder tone, which is intentional. I find that it's better to play with the warm and cold tones inside the progression and the end result will look better and more interesting. I highlighted all the edges with this and painted the inside of most of the previous highlights, only leaving a little bit visible. I also made some scratches around the transition line again. The next color was Deck 10, switching back to a warmer but slightly brighter color again. And as you can probably guess, I did the same thing as before but reduced the size of the highlights quite a bit to fit inside the previous one without obscuring it fully. I only painted some of the edges facing the light with this, leaving the rest only painted in the previous colors. The final highlights I made with Silver Grey, which is quite close to pure white. With this I only added some very thin edge highlights and super small highlights inside the previous ones. Okay, our highlights are now placed, it's time to smooth them out a bit and add some more interesting tones in there. I used a white ink for this, but you can also thin down some pure white a lot and use that in a pinch. The ink is much easier to use though, since most inks are at least semi-transparent, so you are less likely to cover too much with them. Since I was using the ink and it was transparent, I used it basically undiluted and dragged it from the shadows to the highest highlights over the whole surface. I used 2 or 3 layers of this, waiting for the previous one to dry before I applied the next one, which usually just meant that I painted another panel while the others were drying to not lose any time. Now you could leave it at that, but I like to be fancy, so I took the same Dark Sea Blue that I also used for the shadows of the red. Blue-green colors happen to be great shadow colors for both reds and whites. I thinned this down a lot again and then glazed it into the shadows, dragging it from the midtones and ending my brush strokes in the deepest shadow. This smooths out the transitions more, adds a little contrast and color into the white, and also ties the reds and the whites together with the same shadow color. And with that, the 2 most important colors in the scheme are done, now we just have to do the rest. But you know how this goes, it might look like 70% of the models are painted, but this is deceptive and there is always more to paint than it seems. So let's tackle some of the medium-sized colors and start with the metals first. These will be done with grey colors again, and as you will see, that is a bit of a problem since there is a ton of grey and white in this scheme, so we need to try to keep them separate by using different tones. I started this bit by treating the black as my base coat, so I can create a bigger contrast on the metals than on the rest of the elements. I used the dark grey from AK to cover around 70–80% of the surface, marking all the edges, adding bigger highlights in between them and some of the usual scratches wherever I could find the space. The next color in the progression was graphite. I repeated the same steps as before but reduced the size of the highlights as usual. Then for the next highlight I switched to silver gray, and this time I only highlighted the most visible edges facing up and added some really small highlights inside the previous ones. You might have noticed that I already used this color before on the whites, and that it served as the final highlight, but here I wanted to go one step further to create even more contrast. The idea is that we need to sell that this is a different surface from the whites. There the contrast went from dark sea blue to silver gray, here the range is between pure black and pure white. But I still only use this very sparingly, only on some of the most prominent edges and corners. But chances are that at this point you feel like these elements we just painted are a little over highlighted, and despite our best efforts they don't feel different enough from the whites. We can fix that by thinning down some black paint a lot and glazing it from the midtones into the shadows. You can use as many layers of this as you want, but if you do too much, it will obscure all the highlights quite easily, so be careful. Some of the models wear these nice baggy Japanese style pants that are supposed to be black with some highlights. And I was running out of ideas for what gray I should use for this, so I mixed a little white into tenebrous gray, which was too dark otherwise, and I used this mix to highlight the pants the usual way, making sure I caught all the edges. You can of course just substitute this with any gray paint you have available, just try to make it a little different from the ones you already used on the model. And we will stop painting grays in a second, I promise. I took some anthracite gray next and used it to make some smaller and thinner highlights on the pants with some scratches included. I also realized at this point that I was missing the cool cyber chainmail-like thing Infinity models tend to have under their armor panels. So I used the same color for those as well by simply running the side of the brush over them with very little pressure so the paint only caught the raised elements. Next I took some grey blue, which on the pants will be our final highlight. I was way more selective with this, I mostly highlighted the edges and added scratches in the light areas. Finally on the chainmail thing I used some medium grey only in the areas that will be hit by the light the most. Then I took some Black Lotus Express color, slightly thinned it down and washed it over the surface, making it a little different from everything else and creating more contrast and definition by darkening the recesses. And we are finally done with the greys, it's time to paint with some colors again, so let's take care of the backpacks and the holsters. On the box art these are a different color, but I decided that I had enough of the greys and this scheme needs a little color, so they will be camouflage green. I essentially base coated the holsters and the backpacks with this, but I was trying to do it in a way that the deepest crevices next to the raised parts remained black. I did this by overbrushing the surface with the side of the brush with very little pressure so it only hits the raised parts. And I added multiple layers until the raised elements were fully covered. Then I repeated the same thing on a smaller surface with olive green. On bigger elements like the backpack I also glazed a little with this color towards the highlights to make things a bit smoother. On the smaller pouches and holsters I mostly concentrated on some edge highlights and little scratches. And for the final highlight I chose interior yellow, which is a half yellow and half green color, so it's perfect to make our greens pop nicely. I used this mostly on the edges and also added some scratches on the bigger surfaces. Since I was already painting with greens, it was a good opportunity to paint some of the unsheathed power katanas. As if katanas are not cool enough as they are, we will also make them power weapons now. These are supposed to glow, so we need to start from a bright and very saturated color. Slime green is perfect for this. I used the first layer on the whole surface, but the following ones I started further in and dragged them towards the tip of the sword. This created a very subtle transition from dark to bright, from the hilt to the tip. Then frog green was next because it also has some yellow in it, which helps us sell the glow effect. I painted all the edges with this and then I dragged it over roughly 2/3 of the blade towards the tip. Before it could dry, I dampened the brush and feathered out the transition. I did this multiple times, starting the layer a little closer to the tip every time. Pistachio has even more yellow than frog green. I did the same thing with this one, but I reduced the size of the highlights even more. I even painted the super subtle middle edge of the swords with the size of the brush and tiny amounts of pressure. Finally I finished with laser yellow, concentrating mostly on the edges very close to the tip. And there you go, we made a nice glowing green laser katana. The only thing left to do other than the heads are some purple panels. I was contemplating doing these in blue instead, but decided against it since the bases were also supposed to be blue. I base coated everything in white, but you can skip this if you want. I mostly did it because initially I wanted to use fluorescent purple for this, but I ended up with normal acrylics. Finally I settled on using deep purple and I simply painted the whole surface until I got full coverage. For the highlights I mixed in a little bit of white into the purple and marked the edges where I could find them, or created some volumetric highlights inside the purple elements where there were no edges to be found. Now we only have the faces and the hair to paint, and fortunately for us only a couple of the models have their faces exposed, and even those are half covered by masks, so this should be easy. Who am I kidding? We are talking about tiny faces and eyes, so it will be still hell, but it has to be done, so here we go. Let's do the skin tones first. I used multiple thin coats of light brown to base coat everything. I made sure to leave the eyebrows and the eye sockets black though. It is also important to paint the eyelids under those eyebrows as well to separate the eyes and the eyebrows. They are tiny but very important to get right. And speaking of tiny, also don't forget to cover those little ears either. After this was done, I used medium flash, quite diluted, to slowly build up some highlights on the forehead and to mostly cover the bridge of the nose and the top of the cheeks. I finished with similarly diluted layers of radiant flash, emphasizing the same spots but on an even smaller surface. And wherever I felt I went too far, I used glazes of the previous color to fix it. And now for the eyes. First of all, I made sure that the eye socket is painted black. Then I painted the middle with white. Ideally, the shape should be slightly elongated and there should be a very thin black line around it. This might take some time to get right, but don't start doing the pupils until this part looks good. When I felt that it looked alright and even on both sides, I used black to dot the pupils in the middle. You might have to start from scratch a couple of times, but getting this right really adds or takes away from the overall look of the model, so it's worth the extra effort. And now we are really almost there, although at this point I wouldn't even believe myself since I told you that we are done with the grays, but now we have to paint the highlights on the black hair. I took some anthracite grey again and highlighted the raised elements of the hair, following the sculpted details where there were any and drawing thin lines representing hair where there weren't. Then I did the same thing with French blue, but smaller and a little thinner. And finally I used pale blue to finish the highlights. To integrate everything and make it a little different from the rest of the greys and blacks, I took some Black Templar contrast, thinned it down and used it as a wash over the hair. And with that we are done with the models. I'm not going to bore you with how I did the bases in the video. If you are really interested, I detail the steps in the PDF guide on my Patreon. The TLDR version is that I painted the bases mostly blue and then covered everything with some rust effects to create a nice blue-orange combo similar to the box art. And when I was done, the end result looked like this. Not too shabby for roughly 2.5 hours of work per model. The box art looks better of course, but I think I got pretty close considering the time I invested. I hope you guys enjoyed this one. If you did, don't forget to give it a like and subscribe. And before I sign off, I wanted to give a huge shout out to my Patreon members who are supporting the channel, and especially to the ones in the captain level whose names also appear on all the videos. For now there is only one, but maybe after this video some more of you will decide that you want to see your names there, and next time the list will be longer. In the meantime, thanks a lot for watching and for your support. See you in the next one.